There's talk on social media that they're looking at implementing some sort of driver tax where they're taxing per mile. What's your reaction to this?
Our climate policies are not going to help the climate. They're going to help special interests get rich. I think the end goal is that ordinary people wouldn't really have cars. I think that's the end goal. And move number one is to get rid of your gas car and say, don't worry, we're going to get you an electric car. In the end, that they're going to all of a sudden discover, I put in quotes, problems with electric cars.
We're talking about fiscal policies, trade wars, and foreign policy with the next guest, Casey Mulligan, professor of economics at the University of Chicago and the former chief economist for the Council of Economic Advisors for President Donald Trump. Welcome to the show. Casey, good to see you.
Yeah, I'm glad to join you, David.
Honored to host you. Let's start by talking about tariffs, and then we'll talk about your work on energy policies and your research there. And then finally, regulations under Trump and Biden, which you've analyzed, have real implications for costs for American households. Very interesting research there. Starting with tariffs. This just came in the press today. I was telling you offline, this from CNBC. Donald Trump on Thursday brought up the idea of imposing an all-tariff policy that would ultimately enable the U.S. to get rid of the income tax. Sources in a private meeting with a Republican presidential candidate told CNBC. Trump, in the meeting with GOP lawmakers at the Capitol Hill Club in Washington, D.C., also talked about using tariffs to leverage negotiating power over bad actors, according to another source in the room. Let's just talk about the first part first. So getting rid of income taxes, using an all-tariff policy, how would that, just hypothetically speaking, how would that work? Would it work?
I'm not sure you could get as much revenue from tariffs no matter where you set the rate compared to the income tax. Now, maybe you want to get by with less revenue, which is an interesting proposition. The other thing about the income tax, there was the infamous off sound from Romney, who said the 47%, because a lot of people don't pay income tax. So you would be eliminating a tax that roughly half of people don't pay. So whereas the tariffs would be affecting prices that all of us pay.
Right. And these tariffs that Donald Trump, to some extent Biden as well, are these tariffs going to restrict the volume of foreign imports that we get?
There's no question. That's really the point of them. When we've seen them before, they've done that. Ronald Reagan had a trade policy to reduce the volume of imports. So you can be pretty confident about that part of it.
Well, ultimately, what is the aim then? I think there's different, schools of thought or perceptions of why one would want to implement these policies. For example, Arthur Laffer, I spoke with him, and he said that.
But Trump was saying the only reason he threatens tariffs and he proposed them is to get these people to the negotiation table so he can do free trade agreements. And if you look at what his behavior was, especially, I'll just use one example, when he was on his way to meet with Kim Jong-un in Singapore, and he was at the G7 in Ottawa. He had to leave a little bit early, and he apologized to the other 6 members there. And he said, forgive me, I have to leave early, but I think you know what I'm doing. And I think this is really important for world peace. But I want to make a deal with you. I have just a few minutes left. The U.S. is prepared at present to get rid of all tariffs and all non-tariff barriers if all of you guys will too. And there was dead silence. There was dead silence in the room, and they all looked at their shoes. They whistled away. They looked at. I think Trump's, all of his views on tariffs and threatening are words to bring people to negotiate a free trade agreement. These people, these mercantilists around the world, all they care about is access to the U.S. market. And Trump is a negotiator, and I believe a free trader all the way.
He said jokingly to the Financial Times that he told Donald Trump, look, sir, anyone who imports 2 foreign wives has to be a free trader at heart. Apparently, Donald Trump did not laugh at that joke. But the point is, he thinks that Donald Trump is a free trader, and he's just using tariffs to negotiate with their trade partners. What do you think?
Right, that's very similar to Ronald Reagan did as well. Ronald Reagan was dealing with similar set of issues vis-a-vis Japan in those days. Now it's China. So I think history's on your side with that kind of perspective. But there's also another part, also with Ronald Reagan, let me say, of protectionism, protecting particular industries who compete with foreign competitors. Ronald Reagan did his campaign stops in Detroit and talked about the policies that he would do to protect the car companies. And one of them was restricting the import of Japanese cars. So Donald Trump has an election to win. He knows how to win better than I do. And it wouldn't surprise me if that's part of the calculus as well.
This is a critique from a New York University School of Law professor, David Kamen, who wrote on X, broadly substituting tariffs for income tax is a sure way to hit hard, low, and middle income Americans and reward the top. So basically, the bottom would be hurt more by tariffs from the policy. Would you agree or disagree with that assessment?
Yeah, roughly half of people don't pay income tax, and they would be at the lower side of the income distribution. So they would not get a tax cut from income tax directly, at least. And we all purchase some of our goods from imported sources, whether it be buying from Walmart with a lot of Chinese imports or European imports of various types. So yes.
Okay. Well, what is your view on foreign policy in regards to tariffs? Should the U.S. pursue a more protectionist policy, even from today's point of view, and implement tariffs on more goods, perhaps raise tariffs on existing goods?
Well, I think there's a few aspects. One is the issue that Ronald Reagan was dealing with, the intellectual property protections, are even more important today. Our economy is much more intensive in the production of those kind of goods and services. So it's even more important today to make sure that we get fair and legal treatment abroad with what we produce here in America. So the other thing that I would like to see happen would be to lower some tariffs. So we have some tariffs that are very high. And so I could see a policy and supporting a policy where we raise some tariffs that are low and lower ones that are high. And that would be a win-win. And we have particularly the so-called chicken tax, which came before I was born, before you were born, is a very heavy tariff on imported pickup trucks, which is the most common vehicle that American households buy today. So cutting the tariff on that would be really helpful to households, even if it had to be traded against raising that tariffs on some other things that are low rates.
What would you say to the economists who advocate for a more free trade approach whereby we eliminate tariffs, all existing and or future potential tariffs, and that, according to these economists, would make all economies more competitive? It would ultimately increase the standard of living because we're not importing the higher costs of goods into our economy, and our economy ultimately will also be more productive as a result.
There's a lot of truth to that, but most of that's happening on your very high tariff items, like your chicken tax, the tax on pickup trucks. The Jones Act is another. Actually, it's a quota of 0, and it really raises prices. And so, cutting those tariffs and quotas back, and even if it meant bringing some others up, would not have the effects that you mentioned. Lowering a tariff from 2% to 1% or from 2% to 0, not doing that much. Where you get the real mileage is bringing the 25% tariff down to 10.
Is there another way that we can enforce the, I don't want to know if I could use the word respect of international intellectual property laws between our trade partners besides the use of tariffs?
Well, negotiation. I mean, ultimately, you want to have agreement. I mean, we have armies. Those have been used historically to try to enforce what a country wants beyond its borders. You really don't want to see that. We don't want our kids in wars, and the foreigners don't want that either. So it has to be some kind of negotiation. How you put yourself in a strong position, whether it's with military equipment or some other kinds of threats, that's really the foreign policy sorts of questions that are with us today.
Let's analyze the income tax part of the equation. So Trump wants to reduce the income tax and raise tariffs. So we talked about tariffs. Do you agree, generally speaking, that the income tax should be lowered across the board?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of an unstructured question, but most scenarios I can think about involving lowering the income tax would be welcome.
Okay. I mean, we wouldn't, what would we do with the fiscal deficit then if we lower government revenues? Would the deficit widen?
Yeah, so that would be the question. What else are you going to do? Are you going to raise the payroll tax? You're going to raise some other taxes. Generally, the income tax is one of our worst taxes. So if you were to lower it and raise some others, I could see an argument for that.
Do you think there should be a flat income tax or a different income tax for different income brackets?
If you go to these taxes like a flat tax or pure payroll tax or even a value-added tax like Europeans do, does that mean the government's just going to gobble up more revenue? I'm not sure I welcome that. So any kind of restructuring of the taxes that are advertised to improve things, I'd like to see something along with it that says, look, the government has a limit, can't spend more than 20% of GDP or something along those lines to keep from feeding the beast too much. But the flat tax and the payroll tax are very similar, right? Our payroll tax is a pretty flat tax. Most countries, their payroll tax is pretty flat tax. So when you talk about going to a flat tax, more or less what you're saying is let's have more of a payroll tax and less of the income tax, Form 1040, April 15th type of tax.
The Biden administration is proposing an increase in the capital gains tax to 44.6% in its 2025 budget for certain wealthy Americans past a certain income bracket. Do you agree that, well, do you generally agree with this policy? I mean, we're raising the tax on the wealthy, but we're not hurting everybody else.
Well, it's not true you're not hurting everybody else. It's the opposite of the flat tax. The flat tax proposal is to try to have a lower rate, but very broad coverage of it. And now you're talking about a high rate on a very narrow group of people, very narrow group of transactions. And what you end up doing is shifting activity away from those transactions into other ones for tax purposes rather than because that's what's creating value for the final consumer or worker. So that's a pretty bad idea of Biden's.
It's a pretty bad idea. Would it have any material impact on productivity or even the investment activity?
Depends how much revenue it gets. If it's unable to get much revenue, it may not be doing that much damage. Now, the damage always exceeds the amount of revenue that it gets, but if it has enough loopholes, it won't be doing that much damage. If you were to be getting a lot of revenue from that tax, that would point to some really significant consequences at the macro level and affecting wages and investment and those sorts of issues.
Supporters of a raise in capital gains tax point to the fact that historically the capital gains tax was even higher before and it's come down. So, we're not going to see a flight of capital outside the U.S. as a result of this raise. Is that true?
Well, I'd have to look at the details. I'm not sure geography was much part of the proposal anyway. I think what more you would see restructuring of transactions so that they don't involve these super billionaires or whatever you want to call them, and they're done through family members or what have you. They're going to restructure their accountants are going to be busy, and that's not really for business purposes. For tax purposes, a waste of people. Maybe those accountants would be better doing helping our industries, do what they're good at.
I'd like to talk about your work on energy policy. So you wrote an article entitled "Energy Supply in the Biden Era: 2.4 billion barrels untapped," and the last paragraph more or less summarized your thesis. You said that if we were getting back to the Trump pro-drilling policies, supply increase would be 1,000 times greater than the Biden's reserve release policy. Gas prices were less than $2.50 a gallon when Trump left office. And if it weren't for the Biden war on oil and gas, we might be paying even less today. Can you just elaborate more on your findings here?
One of the things America's been amazing at is innovation in the extraction industries, getting oil and gas, natural gas, out of the ground and available to consumers as an energy source. And since about 2013 or so, those industries have just set new records and amazed people on what they can do with comparatively little. And sadly, that progress stopped in 2021. And in fact, ratcheted back, and they were actually less productive than they had been in years before. And so we're not making progress anymore. And we've seen this before in energy. And in the case of nuclear energy in the 70s, when I was a kid, there was a lot of fear, and I could understand around nuclear energy. And so it was very heavily regulated. And basically nothing new's been discovered in nuclear energy because nobody wants to invest in those kind of discoveries if they know that it's not going to be welcome in the marketplace. So it would be sad to see the thing that we were really the best in the world really taken away from us as an industry. And we're starting to see that already. So we haven't hit the milestones that everyone thought we would be hitting today.
So I think Americans all across the country are wondering what needs to be done from a policy perspective to bring down the gasoline price. How would you answer that?
And I'm not sure I focus specifically on gasoline. There's also natural gas, like electricity prices and things like that. There's really three headwinds that appeared in the last 3 years. The ESG movement, environmental, social, and governmental, something like that, where activists have taken over shareholder meetings and discouraged investment in fossil fuel companies. And fossil fuel companies, as a result, especially the smaller ones, the innovative ones, have had trouble raising money. And so they're not able to make the kind of progress they used to. The other thing is the tax cut that you talked about, it happened in 2017. It's an amazing thing for these companies because they're very capital intensive. And that looks like it's not going to last, or there's very concerns that Biden will raise that rate or let rates expire. So that's made it hard for them to raise money because of the tax threat. And then, of course, and as I say last but not at all least, would be the federal regulation. All the new rules put in restricting what oil and gas and coal extraction companies can do.
It's been brought to the attention of some state departments, California, for example, that a lot of people are now switching to EVs. And so the state is losing revenues from gas pumps. And now they're finding solutions to how to fill that revenue gap. Is that something you've noticed, that it could be a problem that states or perhaps the federal government will need to do something else to raise money from lost revenues at the pump if people switch to EVs?
There are definitely states in that situation. Our federal government doesn't rely a lot on gas taxes, but certainly there are some states like California. Illinois has a very hefty gas tax as well.
Yeah. What do you think they'll do? I mean, there's talk on social media that they're looking at implementing some sort of driver tax where they're taxing per mile. It's a pilot program. It's voluntary, but these are ideas that are floating in the air. What's your reaction to this?
Well, I think the end goal, it's not my goal, but I'm not in charge. So
sure.
I think the end goal is that ordinary people wouldn't really have cars. I think that's the end goal. And move number one is to get rid of your gas car and say, don't worry, we're going to get you an electric car. In the end, that they're going to all of a sudden discover, I put in quotes, problems with electric cars, like the revenue issue, like how do you dispose of the batteries and those sorts of issues. And so they'll have us riding the bus.
It's reported that the grid can't handle this increasing demand for electric vehicles as well.
No doubt. I mean, because they're cutting back on the fuels that we use to make electricity. And then they're telling us that we also have to have our cars use electricity when they didn't used to, that you're pushing in opposite directions with that. And it seems crazy. And it is crazy if you take them literally. But I think if their end game is that we don't, we common people don't have a car, then I can see how it works.
You've done some interesting research on Biden's regulation measures versus Trump's, and how the former has actually less cost bearings on American households. So added costs from these Biden-era final rules, you wrote in a note to me, which include both current and expected future costs, amount to almost $10,000 per household. If regulatory costs continue to rise the same rate as they did during the Obama administration, the total cost of Biden's rulemaking over an 8-year period would almost reach $60,000 per household. So what regulations are you referring to, first of all, Casey?
Yeah, the $10,000 was just for his first 2 years, 2021 and 2022, the rules that were actually finalized by then. And then that ratchets up as they get in their groove, and as they really have gotten their groove in 2023, which are kind of additional rules. So it's a wide range of rules. I mean, the energy ones get a lot of attention, but there are rules like they just put down a rule called the joint employer rule. It pretty much prohibits the franchise model of business, which is a wonderful model, again, very American, where somebody would have an idea for a retail product. McDonald's is the prototype, but many, many other retail products. And the guy creates the brand and the recipes and things like that. And then he finds local people who know the geography of the retail spaces and say, look, I'll sell you the franchise and you can sell my product as long as you follow my recipe and stuff. And you figure out where to hire the people and the best way to attract the locals to your shop. And it's been an amazing model. And now it's almost impossible to use that model due to this joint employer rule that Biden put out. So that's an example in the labor area. He's regulating the internet now, very stringent regulation around internet plans. So the internet plan that you have in your house, the internet plans you have in your phone. Obama had tried to have those regulations. We were very much lagging behind Europeans in terms of the speed of our internet, and the costs were very high. And as soon as Trump took office, internet prices, plan prices dropped like a rock. In fact, moved the aggregate CPI, and Janet Yellen, the Fed chair, had to have a press conference to explain what the heck is going on. So our internet prices fell a lot. Our speeds really sped up. And now Biden's taken us back to the Obama years of lack of innovation and high prices. So those are other examples. I could give you examples in healthcare. And then there's examples that, around the electric vehicles. Now he's pretty close to mandating electric vehicles. I think his target is that 70% of all new cars have to be electric. I was just in Palo Alto the other day, where is the most popular place for electric cars, but still 80% of the cars are gas, even in Palo Alto. So this is, extremely disruptive. It makes automobiles very expensive. It adds about $10,000 to the price of a new vehicle. That one rule alone, the typical family's purchasing a new vehicle every 6 years. So, extra 10 grand every 6 years just from one rule. And Biden's doing hundreds of rules, as I've kind of given you a flavor.
Well, Casey, why don't we, just as an idea, why doesn't the government lower tariffs on, let's say, Chinese-made electric vehicles like BYD that are a lot cheaper? Wouldn't that kind of solve this issue of meeting the government's mandate, but also making it affordable for people here?
Well, the mandate's unmeetable, but it is really Ronald Coase talked about this issue.
Yeah.
And when you have, we call it an externality, pollution, something like that, when one person's action harms somebody else who's really not party to the transaction, what do you do? Well, Ronald Coase says you need to bring those people together and have them make an agreement of some kind to modify the behavior. Well, with climate change, the people harmed by climate change, they live on the other side of the world. They're not even born yet. So they're not at the table. So all these so-called climate change policies, they're going to be hijacked for other purposes, like protectionism purposes, like enriching the green industrial complex. There's really, I saw the other day that the climate policy is being hijacked for equity purposes. The economics predicts that's going to happen. Our climate policies are not going to help the climate. They're going to help special interests get rich. And special interest getting rich is just the other side of the coin that you mentioned, David, which is that the consumer pays through the nose. So expect the consumer to pay through the nose. Don't expect it as like a minor bump in the road that will smooth out.
Well, I would like to get your take on the future of energy usage here in the United States, because that has dramatic investment implications on commodities demand, home building, construction, and whatnot. Do you think that a two-part question, the government's demands for electrification, like you just cited, electric vehicle consumption or the zero carbon emissions by, I think, 2050, those targets are realistic? And B, industry are actually able to comply with these regulations over the next 10 to 15 years?
Oh, they're not able to comply because they're not realistic.
Okay.
But that's really the point.
I mean, should the timeline be extended, or should this be scrapped altogether? What's your take?
No, the market should decide. There's no way people in Washington can understand the myriad of circumstances that we have in America. There's 330 million of us, and we all have different circumstances. We live in different places, different temperatures, and the government can't track all that, let alone tell us how to deal with it best. And so individuals should be left to decide for themselves the type of vehicle they want, the type of washing machine they want, and things like that.
It seems to be a coordinated effort around the world, though. It's not just the U.S. Several jurisdictions around the world have already promised similar targets, right? It seems to be a coordinated effort. What is the larger plan here?
Well, again, I think there are special interests in Europe, too. I mean, special interest is not an American disease. I mean, it's a disease of big government. And Europeans have those, too. So the Europeans have solar companies and windmill companies that want to get rich quick, and these policies help them do that.
Well, is there, based on any scientific research that you've studied, efficient or effective way to reduce greenhouse pollutions and perhaps, as the climate change activists would say, reduce our carbon footprint in a sustainable way that doesn't hurt the economy, that's more realistic? Is there such a solution?
Well, I mean, one realistic thing, not a guarantee, would be to wait and see the kind of innovation. For example, in natural gas, this innovation that I told you about, which is viewed as not green, actually has what allowed in between, let's say, 2016 and 2020, allowed the United States to reduce its emissions even more than Obama wanted to promise to the Paris climate people. And that really happened through the market innovation. We discovered this cleaner energy, and we were using a lot of it. And so that's one thing they would look to. And the other thing that we economists talk about is there's always two solutions to externality. If somebody A is doing something to harm B, we can figure out how to get A to do less. That's kind of what we're obsessed with. But is there things that B can do to protect themselves? And yes, they are, especially in this case. I mean, supposedly the damage from climate change happens hundreds of years from now. So we have time to move to the places where the weather's going to get better. We have times to move away from the beach that's going to be wetter than it was in the past. And so adaptation is something the market is very good at. And this particular challenge, wonderfully, it's spread over a long period of time. So it's the perfect situation for adaptation rather than these brute force upfront costs that the Biden administration's been imposing on us.
What about electricity generation? What are your views on nuclear power? On the one hand, some advocates say that this is a reliable, clean source of baseload power. The problem is most of it is farmed or not farmed, mined in Russia, Eastern Europe, Kazakhstan, not jurisdictions naturally friendly to the U.S. right now. What's your take on this?
Well, we have uranium in the United States. There were Obama regulations that didn't let us use that uranium. So again, deregulation would be helpful here. At least some pathway for nuclear innovation. You don't have to go crazy at first, but give companies a reason to try to figure out how to do it better, how to do it safer, how to do it with more power. Innovation has done such amazing things in the past. You have to expect it's got more amazing things to do. Now, if I knew what they were, I would be rich because I would have the innovation.
Sure.
But let's be realistic. Innovation is very normal when people have the opportunity and incentive.
Well, is the U.S. still the leader in innovation in the world, Casey? Now, I've read reports that China, for example, has now more patents overall than the U.S. I'm not commenting on the quality of these patents, but just on a publishing basis, they're producing more every year. One could argue they're leading the pack in innovation. Is that true?
Well, you're right. The patents are a little bit hard to judge. It's worth looking at. A couple industries that we mentioned energy. We've been amazing in energy, beating the whole world badly in our productivity growth in energy. I think another thing where we've done very well is in what they call AI. AI has been around for a long time, but the ChatGPT type of stuff, that's American innovation, and it's we're the leader in that very clearly. Who's going to do it in the future? I mean, there are concerns. Universities, we think, ought to and have been centers for innovation. And there's concerns. I work at a university, and I see these maybe too close. Concerns that we're distracted by other things other than discovering new things. So that would be a problem if the top tier universities, which have been in America traditionally, are no longer capable of that. But maybe some other country would step forward with an innovative university system.
The inflation rate is still above the Fed's 2% target by both core and headline measures. What would your policy proposal be for either the Federal Reserve on the monetary side or Congress on the fiscal side to bring that number down?
Well, number one, it's number one Federal Reserve job to deal with inflation. The massive deficits that we had in 2021 the pandemic was really over. We had no business doing that, and so it was a losing situation, and it's raised prices. Really, what people are upset about, and I'll join them. It's not so much the inflation rate today; it's that the prices are so much higher, and they're not going down. Biden wants to celebrate that they no longer go up 9% every year; they just go up 5% every year. But we want them to go back down to where they used to be, or something of that sort, and that we're not seeing. And I don't know that we're going to be happy until we do.
Some people said that, look, during the pandemic, stimulus checks were given out. It relieved a lot of Americans of stress. This is one argument. And then they extended this argument further. Well, why not just have this in perpetuity to help the lower middle income class, right? Why not have UBI, Universal Basic Income? What's your view on this?
Well, first of all, I would say, well, personally, I think work is a virtue. But even aside from that, work is entirely necessary and it should be rewarded. People, even those people who are retired, they need those of us who work to help support them. So we need workers. And to take away the reward to working by saying, look, you can have more or less the same lifestyle even if you don't work, is a recipe for low living standards for all of us.
Well, what if everyone gets the same amount, even if you're working? Would that make it more fair?
You call it fair, we'll all be poor together.
Okay.
Is that fair? Look at Sweden tried this in the 60s and 70s. The Swedes hated it. And they backed off. They cut their tax rates. They cut their programs. Denmark, same thing. I mean, if you call Denmark socialist today, they get very upset because they say, "Hey, been there, we've done that, we learned a lesson. We don't call us that. That was a fine slur 50 years ago, but not today." And it's disappointing to see Americans. It's a pretty narrow segment of Americans, but rather vocal Americans saying, we should do what Sweden did in the 70s.
Finally, I'd like to evaluate this, a very broad question, but would you say that the standard of living in the U.S. has improved on a real inflation adjusted basis over the last 50 years?
Definitely 50 years. No question.
I mean, people point to the fact that healthcare has become more expensive, college tuition has become more expensive. Millennials now are less able to afford a home, or Gen Zs as well, than their parents or grandparents' generation. These are all things have become more or less unaffordable overall. So, these are counter arguments to that. Yeah.
Well, no, not over 50 years. That's not an argument. Now that it is an argument over the last 10. And that's upsetting when we should have been progressing in the last 10 years, regardless of what healthcare costs. I mean, look at the health. I mean, we have falling life expectancy. Falling life expectancy is unbelievable. Life expectancy was going up. We had World War II and maybe one or two very brief episodes like that where life expectancies fell. But otherwise, that's something we haven't seen, since the Stone Age. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but we had falling life expectancy since 2015. So we're going on 10 years of that. Drug deaths, alcohol deaths, diabetes deaths. Our health is not in good shape, and a lot of that is to be blamed on the way the pandemic was handled and reacted to.
Finally, Casey, before I let you go, I realize you're also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Now, the NBER has several indicators they look at before determining whether or not an economy is in a recession. Just off the top of my head, industrial production, consumer spending, and a few others. Are any of these indicators that they follow on a regular basis flashing recession territory yet?
I'm not involved with that. Now, in general, in the economic outlook, we've been dancing around zero, very low growth rates. So I'm not sure I predict recession. I'm not sure I've been predicting recession at all. I've been predicting very low growth rates. Now you take a very low growth rate and you put a little shock to it, and then it becomes negative, and then it becomes a recession. So recession, we're flirting so much with the recession, we might end up giving her a kiss kind of accidentally.
Well, maybe the Fed's looking at the same data. Are they thinking about reigniting QE, you think, just based on what you're looking at as well? Is that possible?
The Fed and I look at things so differently. My focus is on the real economy, what our industries are capable of doing, what our workers are capable of doing. They have a very different take, which I don't agree with. But anyway,
well, Well, let's comment on that. What exactly don't you agree with, Casey?
They're not abreast of what's going on in our real economy. So to give the example I mentioned earlier in your show about Janet Yellen, she holds a press conference about, what's happening. The CPI is not rising at its 2% rate anymore. What's going on? The market's a little nervous. She has no clue. I mean, she has the computer data, so she can dig in and say, you know what, telecommunications prices fell a lot this month. But she had no clue that, look, this is deregulation. This is Obama made internet too expensive, and most families have 3 plans, so that really adds up. And Trump came in and he said, we're not allowing those regulations that make it so expensive anymore, and it got cheap. And she had no clue that the role that deregulation was playing on our economy, which is because she doesn't really know how to look at the economy. And I think that it's not just on her, that's the Fed staff in general. They don't look at it the way I do. I mean, I focus on these issues like deregulation and productivity.
So are you saying the Fed needs to be even more hawkish than perhaps they've already been to fight the inflationary pressures from these added regulations you talked about?
No, I think they need to understand really to be more humble and understand the role that these other policies that's not in their in their repertoire.
Yeah,
they're really driving our economy much more than the overnight rate on loans between banks, which is the Fed funds rate that gets all the obsession. I mean, you and I will never borrow at Fed funds, but whatever, it gets all the media attention.
Okay, well, let's close on this. So you don't think we're going to get a recession? It's going to get slow growth. Are you concerned about the labor market deteriorating, unemployment past 4%?
It's not so much the unemployment I'm concerned with. It's the wage rates. That's the standard of living. That's the fundamental productivity sort of issues. And what we talked a little bit about the bad health, but it's really a bad human capital. Again, the pandemic and the way we handled it has a lot to do with it. So people are not as productive as they could be, and they're not going to be able to achieve the living standards that they could have on the previous trajectories.
Also, the labor force participation rate has fallen over the last 20, 25 years or so, right? What happened with that trend?
That's also related to segments of the economy that, some of the same communities that are experiencing a lot of the drug deaths and alcohol deaths are also where particularly the men have low labor force participation. So these are different perspectives on a common trend.
Okay. Final question, any way we can boost labor force participation back to pre-2000 levels?
Well, I think taking our safety net programs, which we had back in the year 2000, believe it or not, we had safety net programs, but not as generous as they are today. I think paring them back to what they were, I think would be a better balance between incentives and, compassion for people when they're experiencing difficult situations in their personal life.
Very good. Casey, I really appreciated your time. Where can we learn more about you and perhaps read your work and follow you?
I think your viewers and listeners will really enjoy my book, You're Hired. And that's a book I wrote about being in the Trump White House. I've written books before, so I knew how to do it. I noticed nobody's really telling the truth on either side. So I thought, I'm an academic. I know how to do this. The material is amazing because President Trump is a very entertaining person. Even if you dislike him, people are obsessed. They want to know what he's doing. He's really great raw material. So I had so much fun writing it. People who read it have a lot of fun. They can't put it down. At parts, they spit out their coffee. It's so funny.
Well, give us a teaser of this book. So what is one common misconception about Donald Trump that maybe you addressed in your book?
For example, that when he gives these speeches, that he's going off script. The part where you go off script is on the script. I mean, he's a great entertainer, so he makes it feel genuine. Okay. And it's entertaining. I mean, people enjoy listening to him. But he has some awesome speech writers who I discuss in the book, and they know all the classic speeches in history and the Gettysburg Address and all that stuff. And so he's very well taken care of. Now, of course, they play to his personality and his strengths, and he has a lot of say-so in what he says. But I recommend you Google the UN speech of Donald Trump and look at the part where he says something and the UN laughs. And that was not in the script. All the laughs are in the script except that one. And he says to the UN, you weren't supposed to laugh at that because that's how well programmed his speeches are. They're down to 90 seconds. You know, a State of the Union speech, they know within 90 seconds when it's going to end.
Yeah, he was talking about how I think he had the highest ratings of any U.S. president or popularity, and yeah, they laughed when he made that remark. Did you ever have a chance to meet him, like work with him directly at the White House?
Oh yeah, I was in the book. I discuss what it's like in the Oval Office. It's a lot of fun. It's tiring. He works as hard.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, we'll put it's on Amazon. Your book, You're Hired. It's called Untold Successes and Failures of a Populist President.
Yeah, I have a website too. YourHiredTrump.com. YourHiredTrump.com, and then you can get a little samples and then buy it if you're motivated.
Okay, we're going to put the links in the description, so make sure to check that out. Thank you very much, Casey. Appreciate your time.
Glad to be with you, David.
Yeah, and thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.